afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the VSI webinar series. Today, Tom Sears from Kinsey Sears is going to be in conversation with Adrian Bevington, formerly of the Football Association and Middlesbrough Football Club. I'm going to hand over to Tim, who will explain how you guys can ask questions, and then we'll get straight into it. Tim?
Tony, thank you. Just a reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube being streamed, you cannot ask questions because the comments will not come through to us and you still may be charged. If you're lucky enough to be a participant on this webinar, then you can ask questions by simply using the chat box at the bottom. If time permits, you can use the Q&A and we will bring you in to ask your question personally. And without further ado, Tom, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon again, everybody, and welcome to Adrian. Adrian, great to have a chat with you and really looking forward to this. You spent 17 plus years at the FA. Give us a bit of insight into your journey when you first joined from a career in journalism and how you progressed through the ranks.
Yeah, well, I trained as a good afternoon, everybody, by the way, and thanks for the question, Tom. I left school and started as a trainee reporter. It was previously ICI Chemicals company, 2 years as a trainee reporter. Kept my hand in writing for various publications, freelancing a little bit while doing some other full-time work. Got a break when Middlesbrough were building the new stadium and appointing Brian Robson as the player manager. They formed a PR team and I was fortunate enough to be able to join that team at its early stages. I spent time as a writer, but also learning a little bit more about being a press officer. 3 years at Middlesbrough, which included 2 FA Cup finals, a relegation, a points deduction, Brazilian Player of the Years, all sorts going on, Fabrizio Ravanelli. Then joined the FA as a media officer in late '97 and was really fortunate with my timing that went to the World Cup in '98, which was absolutely fantastic. Gradually worked my way through the ranks, becoming sort of head of media and then eventually director of communications in 2004-05 period. Moving on in 2010 when they established an England department, a Club England department, where I was the managing director of that team. Reassumed communications into that fold a year later as well. So I had 2 pretty significant director roles simultaneously, which was quite demanding, and eventually moved on from the organisation at the end of 2014 after 5 World Cups, 3 European Championships.
And you didn't win any of them?
No, then I went and worked with Wales for a year and got to the European Championship semi-finals.
That's a bit cruel of me. Adrian, how did the organisation change over that 17-year period? You must have seen massive differences from when you joined to the time you left.
Yeah, so many, Tom, and it's on a number of different levels insofar as media landscape, which affected the whole industry. When I joined, we didn't have a website. World Cup '98, I don't believe we had a website. Sky Sports News came into play straight after the French World Cup. Social media didn't really start having a massive impact until the World Cup in 2010. So they were some of the big landscape changes with the media in that regard. Physically, I started at Lancaster Gate when there was about 100 staff, moved across to Soho Square with Adam Crozier in 2001, I think it was. Whole sea change of the organisation that way, transformational period where the company grew in its numbers, but also the demographic, I would say, became very much more male-female. A good split, a much younger organisation, very commercial-minded organisation, which then eventually moved us to Wembley Stadium, I'm going to say, later part of the decade on a full-time basis. And again, the organisation grew significantly insofar as personnel because you had to operate a stadium. And then the opening of St George's Park as well, following on that period, which, again, another workforce that came into play. So the organisation changed insofar as where it was placed geographically. But if you think back to when I first joined, it was very much the image of the Blazer to then the advertising world of Adam Crozier. And that was undoubtedly the biggest cultural and transformational change I've ever been through in my working life. From Adam, we then went into Mark Pallius as the chief executive. Very different type of person. Mark, obviously, with a strong football background. He very much someone who was he had a numbers person. Mark's period was curtailed in quite a high-profile set of circumstances, as we may recall. Then we appointed Brian Barwick, who came from as a senior TV executive, as the chief exec. He was in situ for, I think, about 4 or 5 years, Brian. Then it was Ian Watmore, coming from a very different background again, who he was also in with David Treisman, Lord Treisman as the chairman, who was a lot more visible a chairman to Jeff Thompson, who I'd previously worked with before. David and Ian went both quite quickly in different circumstances, and that led to quite a period of turbulence with the leadership at the top, and that, you know, did present quite a few challenges, because you can't keep changing leadership in a high-profile organisation in particular, any organisation, but one as high-profile as the FA, to change the leadership so frequently was a big challenge. And also when your national team coach is changing as well, so had to deal with a lot of that during that period.
And that's a really interesting point, Adrian. You know, quite a tumultuous period during those years. How do you cope with that constant change, constant refreshing, different leaders, different voices, against the backdrop of what's often been described as quite archaic governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, you're living, you know, the organisation is living every day through a very public lens as well, which a lot of companies never, ever have to manage that level of scrutiny. You know, much bigger companies, quite frankly, but, you know, they're you know, if a big finance company has an issue, it may appear in the finance section of the newspapers, shall we say, but, you know, during that period, you know, with foreign coaches and high profile issues and the golden generation of players, as they were labelled, we were massively in the spotlight, and it was quite a big political football as well during that period. So coping with it, coping with the change of direction, I think is difficult, even if the people themselves are, you know, I was fortunate to work with so many really good people that inspired me. But dealing with the constant change just doesn't give you that level of calmness that you need. And I think we were running parallel to the Premier League at that time, who, you know, Richard Scudamore was in situ for a significant part of that period. And I think we saw the calmness in which the Premier League was able to operate during that period, much to Richard's credit, because he's a fantastic leader. But they didn't have that chopping and changing. And I just think it's very difficult to be effective if you're changing as much as we were doing at that time.
You've worked with some really high-profile individuals across those years, and you mentioned Richard Scudamore and the various chief execs and chairs that you worked under. What are the common denominators of the ones that really stood out for you in terms of being a highly successful leader in the sports industry? Yeah,
I mean, I'd have to highlight Adam Crozier as being someone who stands out for me in particular, because Adam was a very young man when he took on the job as FA chief executive, and before that we'd had Graham Kelly, who really was kind of the old-fashioned secretary of the league, moving into the CEO type role. Adam came from a very commercial background. He'd been at Saatchi's, and he was such an inspirational person to work for. And I think if you speak to anybody who was hired during that period, or a lot of people who were young people when he first came in, he empowered people. He set out some really big visions for the organisation. We knew what we were there to do. It didn't always please everybody externally, because there was a lot of change going on. You know, saying we were going to knock down Wembley, appointing a foreign coach, bringing all these new overt branding sponsors. It was very different to what the FA was all about. Moving to Soho Square really went against the traditional grain. Do you want your national association being in the heart of Soho? But he carried a lot of people with us, and he was just, you wanted to work for Adam. He really gave you that, you know, going into work was a positive experience, and you felt that he was alongside you all the time. But he had such a light touch. I'm sure there was a lot of micromanagement there, but it never felt like it was. So he was really inspiring. I worked with good people as well who have been around sport and media for a long time. People like David Davis and Nick Coward, who's been in various sporting positions. Again, very different people. Brian Barwick, I'm quite biased with Brian because Brian was the one who gave me the comms director job permanently. And Brian and we went through a lot of difficult days together. Sometimes you're on the hook for things that you're not necessarily always completely in control of, as we know. And Brian, Brian went through the mill quite a few times, but he was a great person to work with, Brian, and he was a very, very loyal person to be around. So I've got a great deal of respect for him in that regard. Ian Watmore, totally different type of person to Brian, but again, you could see with Ian, it'll be interesting when he goes into the cricket. He's a real innovator, and he was looking at things on the TV side of things that where we are now. But at the time, most of us were thinking, what's he thinking of there? But he was actually well ahead of the game in that regard, with people like Simon Green, who then went on to BT Sport.
You've also held high-profile roles at a senior club in Middlesbrough. How do you find culturally the difference and operationally?
Well, I think working at any club, and I've obviously worked at a few clubs in senior roles as a consultant as well. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time with Nottingham Forest under the previous regime for about the whole season, really. And I think the difference is when you're working at club football is that you're just not, unless you're dealing with a Manchester United or one of the biggest clubs in the Premier League, you're not under the same level of scrutiny that you are with a national organisation. And likewise, the workforce is obviously a lot smaller in the main as well. So it should make you a lot more agile with your decision making. If your structure's right, and that's kind of, I've been away from the FA since the end of 2014, as I say, and worked with a lot of different organisations during that period, Tom, and it's given me a lot of personal development during that time where, to step out of the fire, so to speak, and look at what works, how you should really set about what are you strategically trying to do, culturally, what are you trying to develop within the organisation, because I'm more convinced than ever now, and that's the sort of thing that, you guys talk about at VSI a lot. The cultural piece is massive. If you don't get the culture right, I just don't think you're going to have to be the luckiest organisation on earth to achieve success if your culture's not right. And I've been really impressed with England under Gareth Southgate since I left, because Gareth for me is someone who is just the epitome of developing a perfect culture.
And how do you think he's gone about that process? Obviously, we've seen certain England managers where the culture seems to be almost toxic and pretty disparate amongst the group. And now, like you say, Gareth Southgate seems to have really brought the players together and got the country behind the team again, if you like. How's he going to get about that process?
Well, it didn't happen by chance. There was a lot of work went on when Dan Ashworth first came into the organisation, and it was, again, that was a really good appointment by Sir Trevor Brooking, which I think often gets forgotten. Dan came in and he brought in good people around him. He had Matt Crocker, who's now gone back to Southampton, and Matt, Dan, like Dave Redding, with Gareth, did a lot of work on the DNA, and the DNA is a big part of where we've seen England develop over that period. It's not happened by chance. Coincided by something that we were being told 10 years ago, that we were going to have a really exciting batch of players in the second half of this decade that's just finished. So that rang true. But I think the big piece of the jigsaw beyond the plan, which did unlock a lot of the issues, the whole fear factor around playing with England, they found themselves with a person in charge in Gareth Southgate. How they got to that point was, not necessarily the most straightforward path to it. But Gareth, I think his experience as an elite player, his personality as a natural leader, his qualities of integrity, being inside of the FA and the development teams, and then with the under-21s, it was kind of a perfect storm, really. And I just think he has managed to make the players and the staff come together as one. The players, for me, look like they love playing for England as much as they love playing for their clubs. They look like they're genuine teammates, more so than it would appear they were during the period that I was at the FA. So I think his leadership there and the people around it, they've done some great planning work and managed to get into the mindsets of the players. And with that, they've opened themselves up in a communication style that has made them very welcoming. And the engagement piece before the last World Cup was exactly what was needed. But because it came from the manager who got the big picture, it sort of all went off in the right direction.
It's a really interesting point you make, Adrian, that Gareth's appointment was probably more by accident than design. You've been involved in recruitment at a club level, but also in your roles at the FA. How did you get it right? What are you looking for in people to assume these positions in the sports industry?
I haven't always got it right, that's for sure. But it's look, I think it's about understanding what you are as an organisation before you look to make the appointment. And I think for me, again, experience helps you a lot in that regard. But you see a lot of organisations chop and change and go from one extreme to another extreme when they're appointing leadership positions, particularly football managers and coaches. And I'm an absolute convert, and have been for many years, that you build the structure, you build the model, so that whoever the head coach is should actually reflect and fit in with the personality criteria you're looking for, the football style, the principles that you're looking for, so that there's not a radical overhaul when you make those changes. Look, we weren't in that mode when I was involved with England, so we went from, I wasn't directly involved in the appointments of Kevin Keegan or Sven-Göran Eriksson, but then when Sven left, we were promoted from within with Steve McLaren, who had been successful with Manchester United and with Middlesbrough, and he'd worked with England for many years. So there was a logic to that, even if people didn't all support it. There was a logic to it. Obviously, it didn't work out with Steve, but so then we felt that we needed to go for a surefire winner, and we went for Capello because we had to get someone who we believed would definitely qualify us for that World Cup in South Africa, because we simply had to qualify for that World Cup, and we did comfortably. Something that gets forgotten, but reflecting on that, but now you realise culturally that wasn't the right appointment, and that's not criticism of Fabio, because Fabio did what he was supposed to do in getting us to the World Cup. But insofar as building something more long-term and sustainable, it's about that model. And I look at people like, say, Stuart Webber at Norwich, and I look at what he's the architect of there, and that inspires me. And that you kind of now know the Norwich model, don't you? You look at it and it just makes sense to you. You look at Brentford, they're not all copies of each other, but you can see that they've got a clear identity and a clear path that they're trying to follow. And I think that's the right way that you should go about it.
It's interesting that you touch on clubs like Norwich and Brentford, where they seem to have very strong cultures. They seem to have a very definite framework that they're working to. How have you tried to incorporate that sort of way of thinking in your career over the years?
Well, I think it's, as I've said it a few times already in this conversation, I think experience, if you can't develop your own self-awareness and your own experience, you're not the right person to ever be in a leadership position. I think I've become someone who's, I'm really, really self-analytical and very self-critical, and, try to look at every decision I make and, work out where yourself, where you've done well. I think, it's getting that, having the vision in the first place about what you want to achieve, and then sitting down with the core people who are going to go on that journey with you to map out what it is you want to be, how you're going to get there, how you're going to build that culture, how you're going to bring the people who are already in the workforce with you on that journey. Are they the right people to go on the journey with you? If they're not, how do you change that and make a massive change culture? Because if you've not got everyone, even the junior people, energized in the same way and prioritizing things the same way and understanding what it is you're trying to achieve, because the internal piece is as important as anything else. They're the engine that's going to drive you forward. Get all those components together, and then as someone like Stuart, and I saw Ross Wilson last week at Rangers talking similarly as well, communicating very effectively about what the plan is for the organisation. So then you can get the buy-in of the supporter base and the wider communities, and that also helps you then commercially with all of your partners along the way as well. So that's how I would foresee things.
And how do you develop the personal resilience and fortitude in what's a volatile industry, and football probably the most volatile of all sports and high profile, obviously? How do you develop the qualities that keep you going throughout a career that's spanned a long time now?
Well, I think that's something that's just within you. You know, it's really interesting. I spent, a few years working very close to Dan Ashworth, and it was interesting observing Dan at close quarters. And Dan is a very, very resilient character, very, very clear in his thinking. I don't think I was someone who quite enjoyed the battle, shall we say, when I was in my sort of communications period. And as I've become older, I've become much more focused on strategy rather than immediacy. And looking at people like Dan when he first came in, and Dave Redding as well closely. And again, I didn't spend a great deal of time working with Dave. We overlapped by a short period, but the real absolute mental commitment to what they were trying to do, the level of detail in what they were applying. And, we talked before, Tom, about professional standards, and it's something that I've always personally been very, very committed to myself. But then it's just been reinforced by seeing people like Dan and others like that. Gareth Southgate is the same. Everything, every day that you go to work, everything has to be done to the highest standard. And you shouldn't need to be saying it all the time. It should just become an automatic mind process that you go through.
Excellent. Changing tack slightly, Adrian, you've been probably the most sought after commentator on the current situation, and you appear here, there and everywhere, giving expert views on the crisis facing football. Hundreds of millions at stake, diverse stakeholders' opinions, vested interests, the safety of players, officials, ultimately supporters at stake eventually when we go back. How do you sort all that out in football? Well,
I think we've been lucky that we can observe what's happening with the Bundesliga and how they kick-started at the weekend. It was really interesting when Steve Parish spoke and gave an interview in the Sunday Times, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, where he was very clear, there's compassion, because obviously we're dealing with safety and well-being, life of people here. And that should always be at the forefront of our thinking. And I think that's what everyone has said who's been involved in this debate. But we can't divorce this completely from the fact that there is a huge financial element to this as well. Because if we want football to be like football has been, and we're all very proud in this country of the football product that we have and the pyramid that we have to try and make sure that we're protecting it financially. And the reality is, from the figures that I'm aware of, if it means losing £1 billion by not getting the game on, and the 760 million of that, I think, through the TV rights, you've got to try and find a way, if you can, in the same way that Germany have. And I think, look, to be fair to the leaders of the Premier League and of the clubs, there's obviously been one or two issues of debate, whether it be the neutral grounds and so forth. But I think they've all clearly tried to make sure that they're going through the various protocols. They've had a lot of meetings. I believe it's Richard Garlick who's leading it with the medical people to put those protocols in place. They've got to keep the players fully informed, and the players have got to weigh up whether it's for them or not. But I think the fact that we've seen Germany, it looks like Germany's come through this reasonably well after the first weekend. That should give confidence to everybody in our game. And ultimately, if the players and the managers are, properly briefed and given as much information as possible so they can make an informed opinion, hopefully, as many of those players will cross the line and be part of the squads when we do, as I believe, will kick off at some point during the period of June.
When you've got clubs at the bottom end of the table potentially facing the drop and relegation to the Championship, hundreds of millions at stake, how do you reach a consensus with those clubs who are perhaps desperate not to see this season continue, press the reset button and start afresh?
Well, I think the ultimate question there, and I don't know whether this is actually being asked, but I guess the ultimate question is for the Premier League to say to the clubs, when we say the Premier League, look, the executive is representing the the members' clubs, we don't lose sight of that. But the question is, do you want to continue and play the season out? Yes or no? And if it's no, okay, there's £1 billion going to be lost. Okay, then we've got to find a model for relegation through points per game or whichever system they go down, as has been the case in other leagues. You're still going to potentially lose 3 teams that way. You're going to find consensus pretty quickly that actually you'll find a way to play it out rather than go down the mathematics formula, I would guess, as a preference. So that, I think that in simplistic terms, but also I think, you know, beyond that, and let's try and see the bigger picture here if we can do. Everyone's fighting for themselves, and you know, people like Paul Barber and Scott Duxbury have been either on the record or doing a lot of media. And it, you know, I think it was Scott who said that it's 20 clubs with vested interests. Yes, it has, and that's a perfectly valid point that Scott made, and he made it in a very, 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 very good way, in my opinion. But ultimately, there's a big piece here as well, and the Premier League revenues, which is over £9 billion in 3 years, that isn't just for the Premier League clubs. You know, a big chunk of that does go back into the Football Foundation. It goes into the solidarity payments. It goes into the PFA. And so any loss of revenue will have an impact on the wider game as well. And I think it's important that we consider that. So that's why I think there's been this commitment to try and get the game running if we possibly can do. And as I say, on the back of what we've seen at the weekend in Germany, hopefully that will move us forward. But I don't want to say that glibly in a way that I'm not respecting the position that individual players have spoken about. And I'm very conscious as well that, you know, the statistics around BAME players perhaps being more vulnerable, that does need to be explored so they've got, you know, confidence as well. And, you know, because obviously we've got such a large number of players from the BAME communities.
Sorry, could I just, there's a question come through. Apologies, Tom. I know we normally wait to the end, but this is quite relevant in what's just been said in the topic. So Ian's shouted out, how do you consider long-term damage to the product of rushing it back versus bringing it in properly? And I get what he's saying with this, because watching the German product, as he's quite rightly said, at the weekend was pretty uninspiring, right? There was no atmosphere there. You could say, well, it's because of this or it's because of that, but actually the way that we enjoy and consume football has completely changed because of this. And I suppose what he's saying, will all the diehards lose interest? I know it's kind of a double-barreled thing, and it puts you on the spot.
No, it's an absolutely fair question, and I understand the question, and it's every time I've been on a TV or radio discussion, it's a sort of question that comes my way, because look, people, ultimately football fans, we're all passionate about football because we either love playing it or love watching it, and we love watching it with a crowd. That's what we grew up with. But the truth of the matter is, and this is my point picking up on Steve Parrish's previous comment, it's not totally exclusive. We're not in a perfect scenario here, and we have to find a way through it, because it would appear that we're not going to have crowds next season either. And if we're in a situation where we're not having crowds next season, how on earth are we expecting clubs to survive if we don't have crowds? So I get the point, even watching the games in Germany the weekend, which I personally enjoyed, accepting they're in a sterile environment. I think we might as well, if we can, if it's deemed safe, get up and running as quickly as we can to get this season concluded. And then you've got a genuine sporting meritocracy at the end of it, rather than potential, God knows what falls out of it if you end up doing it by points per game. And then we're ready to roll again next season. Otherwise, we could just end up waiting and waiting and waiting. And when will it be deemed safe to play football? And this is not a decision that the football authorities are taking in isolation. They're obviously taking a lot of guidance from the government, from the chief medical and science people, you know, because ultimately, before they say yes, they've got to have their support on that front.
Okay, I think it's really interesting. Sorry, Tom, I know it was really relevant, and yeah, just bring it across, because I know Andy's got a question as well. But you know, as soon as you're ready, but I'll just bring Andy in if that's cool.
Yeah, just carrying on from that, Adrian, what do you think the longer term implications are? Because even before the current situation, There were clubs in lower leagues in financial difficulties. There's been talk of salary caps, congestion of the fixture list, too many competitions. If you had a blueprint for the game for the next 10, 15 years, what would that look like?
Well, we can't carry on with the numbers the way they were, certainly outside of the Premier League, and we definitely won't be carrying on like that moving forward. And again, it's been very well documented in recent weeks in the discussions. The wages to turnover ratio in some circumstances is 100% and way beyond in some at Championship clubs, and that clearly just is not sustainable. So I think it makes a lot of sense to look at a capping system. As once you go outside of the Premier League, I'm not particularly a big fan of capping the maximum salary an individual can earn. I do prefer the model where it's it's in comparison to your turnover, or there's a block figure that you can use as your overall salary. I also think as well that we have to be open-minded, and it's a time for everything to be on the table insofar as creative thinking. Is it right that we, do all our clubs need to be full-time further down the pyramid? Do we look at regionalisation again that we had decades ago? I don't know. You need to see the numbers to see how that works, and it may actually not be a purposeful thing to do. But I think now is the time more than ever that everybody should be putting their creative hats on, and we're certainly going to need to. If we've not got crowds next year, how are we, going to make it possible for clubs in League Two, as an example, to exist? There's got to be a lot of creativity around season tickets, how you're streaming games, and keeping that engagement going. Because I think the point was made about, you can easily lose football fans and get out the habit of following football if you don't keep them with you. So it's whatever you can do with all of the different partners that we have that can come up with a creative model, making the access better than it's ever been before. And let's be honest, we have brilliant access as it is through our broadcast partners, but what more can be achieved through the broadcast and make the fans who are not in the stadium potentially still feel like they've got a touch point? The way that social and digital media is used, the way archive is used, the way the documentaries that we've seen, a lot of the American sports use that everyone's talking about, and English football has started coming to that over the last couple of years. The creative thinking has got to be its best, and it's not just the leaders who should be deciding on the creative thinking. It's about getting the people who are maybe some of the young people who are in clubs and federations and leagues, or with broadcast partners, with sponsors. They've got some amazing ideas, and they're the people of the future. What can they feed in to help best decisions be made?
That's a really good point, Adrian. And just touching on what you mentioned there, the overall governance of the game at FIFA level, obviously we had one of the biggest scandals sports ever seen with Blatter and so on, and you'd have experienced some of those individuals during your time with the FA. Are we in a better place now under the new regime, or is there still work to do?
Yes, I think we are in a better place. I don't know the devil of every detail, but I've been impressed with UEFA under Cheferin. I think he's led from the front. I think he's communicated well, particularly during this period. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that he's said, but I think he's been really, really forthright and clear from the minute that he came into the job, actually. And then you've got Gianni Infantino on the FIFA side of things, and there's always going to be a little bit of tension between FIFA and UEFA, and there'll be various grades of that. But Gianni, again, he's a very good communicator. Gianni, he's obviously a very, very clever man who's been around, elite end of football politics for decades now as well. So I don't know. I get the feeling that FIFA. Let's concentrate on FIFA. I don't believe the brand of FIFA is anywhere near as damaged as it maybe was 4 or 5 years ago.
And where do you see the big opportunities for FIFA to develop the game? Over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the explosion of African football. We've seen new leagues in places like China, India. Where do you think the new opportunities lie and where the game should develop?
Well, I think you've rightly identified various. There's always, the less established territories. So there's that element of it. I think the developments in women's football, we can't lose sight of the growth that's taken place there over the past 2 decades. And obviously different countries have worked at different speeds to others. But I think what we must ensure is that during the period and what comes out of COVID-19, that women's football doesn't then fall off the agenda because it's convenient. It's not seen as important as men's football. So I think that's really important as well. I think a big piece of what FIFA and UEFA, where they can be as most effective is not just with what they're doing with tournaments around the world, but it's the education piece. And they already do masses of this, but that putting those infrastructures in place in countries that don't have anything like the revenue that the big nations have is crucial, because that ensures that the global game is continuing to evolve. And then you've got the other tangent of the commercialization and the creative mindset of commercialization. And we've seen the way that esports has developed over the past 5 years. I mean, that now it's here to stay, and how that grows and how we combine that as far as events with major men's events and also women's events, and growing that side of it, because young people want it, and it's tapping into the mindsets of young people so that we're chiming with them, and that football keeps pace. Look, we're very fortunate. Football is the global game, but that doesn't mean you should rest on your laurels, and making it accessible to people so that when there's billions of pounds coming into the industry, one of my biggest concerns has always been about pricing young people out of it. I was fortunate, it's a long time ago now, but when I first started going to football on my own as a teenager, it was less than £1 to go and watch. And that made it accessible. And that's made me a fan for life. And I think accessibility is absolutely key, and accessibility on so many different levels, not just cost. We've got to make sure that we are also making it a safe environment so that we're inclusive to everybody as well. And that's something that if we don't stay at 100% speed on that, the people who shouldn't be around football or any environment will find a way in. So that has to be worked at continually too.
Brilliant. Adrian, last question for me, and this will be an interesting one to get your views on. Qatar World Cup, fantastic opportunity to develop a new territory for the game, or a model of corruption and folly?
Well, unless something dramatically changes, Qatar's going to go ahead in 2022. I've had the pleasure of going out there a few times, and I've seen all the plans for the stadium. I think as a participating nation, subject to all things being equal with COVID, if that tournament goes ahead with the crowds as we would hope, I think it will be an incredible tournament with the best stadiums that we've ever seen. It will be the easiest tournament ever for a team to navigate around because of the close distances. The training camps will be the best training camps that you've ever played at. So I think there's a lot of positives there, and I think it can be a very good fan experience too. I think they are, I know from speaking to some of my contacts who are based with the 2022 team that they are, focusing very, very much on the fan experience out there. And that's something that FIFA themselves, they will want that to work. So look, I understand the debate the debate of the process for how Russia was voted for, how Qatar was voted for. But let's be honest with you, when Germany won the right to host the World Cup in 2006, there was all sorts of cases that have recently just been concluded in the last month relating to that. So, my preference now is to focus on the positive, which is, in my opinion, subject to where we are with COVID and us getting back to some level of normality, I think it will be a great tournament.
Excellent. Adrian, fascinating talking to you. Some really interesting views and opinions and great insight. And I'm sure we've got lots of questions, so I'll hand over to Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Really insightful indeed, Adrian. And I know that Andy has been jumping at the bit to ask you a question going back to the mid-conversation around Dan. Over to you, Andy.
Adrian, that was fascinating, by the way. Really fascinating.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to take you back to your thoughts on strategic leadership, which occupies much of Tony and I's thinking in VSI and the wider group of our current delegates and alumni. And you referenced Dan Ashworth, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that his success at the FA has perhaps not been recognised to the degree it should have done. He's at Brighton now, and they've gone there with a clear plan. That plan is now going to be challenged by the potential of relegation. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how you may maintain, what level of bravery you need to maintain your strategic direction when you may hit something of a bump along the way.
Well, good question, Andy. And I think that comes back to the strength of leadership across the organisation, the qualities and values that have been built in the first place. And if you look at Brighton as a club, as a live example, they've got Dan, who is obviously an outstanding technical director. They've got a chief executive in Paul Barber, who, you know, is a very modern, he's a commercial savvy individual, but he's also a fantastic communicator. They've got an owner who's invested massively into the club and is clearly passionate about Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club long term. They've built a brilliant stadium. They've got a coach in Graham Potter who, you know, he just fits that club so well. And, you know, I know he's someone who spent a lot of time talking about emotional intelligence. And I believe right across the leadership you've got there at Brighton, there's a huge amount of emotional intelligence. And my expectation would be that if the worst case scenario happened to Brighton, I'm not saying it will, but if it did, I think Brighton would stay strong to their values and beliefs. And I think Dan, Paul, and the owner would want Graham to continue, and they will try. You know, they decided when they appointed Graham, they wanted to take things in a slightly different direction in how they wanted to set up moving forward, right? You know, and that obviously caused a great deal of discussion at the time. But the point you make is about how has an organisation got the discipline to stick with it, and that's down to the leadership, and that's, you know, you get paid big bucks when and that's what you get your money for. Have you got the discipline to stick with it? And I expect Brighton would if they had that situation.
Excellent.
Thanks again, Adrian. Tony, you've got a couple of questions they've been pinged to you, my friend, haven't you?
Hi, Adrian. Two questions that have come through from the guys that are listening on the other end here. There's one from Kelly, and it touches on slightly what you've been talking about, but she's asking for a little bit more clarity. She's saying, who are the individuals that you've worked with where you've taken your inspiration from, and what specifically was that?
Okay, well, I mean, I've mentioned Adam Crozier as a chief executive. I'd have to say Gareth Southgate, because I've known Gareth since he was a player. You know, we used to occasionally have breakfast in the England dining room, and I've observed Gareth a lot insofar as his, you know, his values. So Gareth would be someone, not just because he's become a coach, but just someone as an individual that I look at what he does and I just think he's got great leadership values. Someone else who really impressed me in slightly different style to Gareth, but is Chris Coleman when he was with Wales. Watching Chris had again a really great man management style with the players. You could see the players really enjoyed being with him, and he was a leader and he enjoyed leadership. And watching him during that European tournament in France, he wanted to be out there every day speaking to the media, not because he wanted to be in the limelight, but he wanted to be the person who was leading and taking some of that pressure off some of the players. And so his leadership qualities were outstanding there. To be honest with you, there are so many people that I've worked with. Name checking individuals is slightly difficult, but you take in bits and pieces from different people all the way along. And I've been fortunate over the past 5 years that I've worked with so many different types of people as a consultant in different capacities as well, that you see a lot of strengths and weaknesses. And even working with, for a very brief period, I worked with the people when they were buying Portsmouth Football Club, the American owners, and watching Michael Eisner, who's obviously been, a really senior figure with Walt Disney and Paramount Pictures, and watching how he went about the purchase of the club when they had to win a vote at the town hall. Michael was really, really impressive, and you take bits and pieces from that as well.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Second question is just reading it off the screen here. This is from Ed Airy, who's one of our CEO delegates. It says, interested in given the number of us looking for roles in sport, as to Adrian's views on what sport he thinks will emerge well out of this crisis.
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I think, let's just take a step back. People will definitely, from an outside point of view, people will remember how organisations have behaved during this period. And I think that will have an impact on perhaps how they move forward. And it's, though we're probably not at the stage yet, but it's how any sporting organisations use the opportunity to act with real integrity during this period, but also take the opportunity to reshape things as we're coming out of it for the better. And so therefore, I think there are a lot of organisations, sporting bodies at the moment that have that opportunity on the horizon, and it's how people take that opportunity and exactly what they do before you can make a judgment call on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Clarity, I agree with that. I hope that answers the question, Ed. And then the very final question we've got here, Adrian, is from Ryan. He doesn't give his surname, but he says he works in football. And he says, like you, Adrian, I've worked for both an NGB and a club and found it difficult to adapt to both organisations. How did you adapt, and what were the challenges between an NGB and a club organisation?
It probably depends on which way around you've done it. I mean, even though I went in from Middlesbrough to the FA, I was in quite a junior position at Middlesbrough the first time round. So the FA was really what moulded me. I think then going out of that and suddenly, the first job with a club I had after leaving the FA was with Forest. And even though I was a consultant, only doing a few days a week, there was a lot of responsibility given to me by the owner. And you walk in and you realise that you've got people there who are absolutely committed, passionate about working for that organisation, but you haven't got huge numbers of people and you don't necessarily have a great deal of experience in those areas. And it's suddenly, wow, how can you possibly shape something as quickly as you can and draw more experience that you have to use your contacts? So I think the size of the organisation is the thing that hits you most when you go into many clubs. And then I think the other piece as well is you get a lot of people who have worked at clubs for many, many years, and then so they're culturally they're used to working a certain way culturally and have done for many years. And that means that managers and players maybe come and go and pass through, but the way of working remains the same. And if you really want to make or feel there's a need to affect massive change, that is one of the biggest challenges. Hopefully changing the people to come with you rather than changing the people to move them out on that journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, very much so. Thanks for that, Ryan. Good question. Tom, have you got anything that you'd like to finish off with?
Yeah, just one final question for me, Adrian. And it's interesting we touched on who's going to come out well of the current crisis and who isn't. What's your view of a couple of the high-profile clubs, Liverpool in particular, and they're applying for furlough and then making a U-turn? Has that damaged their brand, or do you think they've got away with it?
I think it was obviously a poor judgment call, and it did damage them for a short period. To be fair to Liverpool, I think they've got so much in the bank off the pitch with the ownership model that they've got and the way that they've worked both from a CSR point of view, commercially, and also football strategically. the fact that they, rectified that decision within a relatively short period of time, I don't think it will damage them too much long term.
Excellent. Adrian, again, fantastic talking to you. I look forward to catching up in person as soon as we can. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
VSI, thanks for your time. Really enjoyable, as always. For everyone that's on the panel, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any further questions, you can send them into VSI and we can get them across to Adrian and he can get back to you on those. Until next week, guys, look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Cheers, Adrian.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers,
Take care.